All right, hey people, wait. What's up? There we go. All right. Well, I I didn't write anything or prepare anything. I kind of just wanted to riff off of what we were talking about last time. Um, I've been doing a lot lately, you know, in addition to personal life stuff for around the project and trying to get everything organized. I'm in a pretty good spot now because I figured out all my kind of near future plans anyway, so I feel stable enough to where I can really fully focus on this and you know make some plans on how to make it better and actually build it with some consistency. Whereas in the past, I've gotten these interruptions for having to go on deployment or do some stuff for work, or we got this big inspection coming up or whatever. So I'm not really having to deal with that so much anymore. So it's a good opportunity to really grow the group and grow the channel. And, I'm looking for folks who want to collaborate on stuff, whether it's content or just like brainstorming or talking, having conversations, coming on the stream, talking. We can set up another camera, have a conversation about whatever you guys want to talk about. So looking to do some of that kind of stuff here in the near future. Um, the big thing we were talking about last week was kind of this idea of integral politics and this theme of modernity and liberalism and how we got into all that and where we're at now. Um, and it's crazy because people we get lost in the weeds so much about just like pop politics, especially around election time right now, where it's like, who should we vote for? Is it Trump or Kamala? And I don't mind talking about that. Like, we can dig into that stuff, but something that I'm always coming back to is, that's like the two-party system is it's not going to change anything. Like, it's keeping everything the way it is, and actually, it's slid more towards the favor of the big corporations and everything. I mean, some with some recent developments. A lot of people like to focus on the Citizens United stuff, and the money in politics became a really big thing after that. The super PACs and just talking about the corrupting influence of money in politics. But um, I like to look even deeper than that. I mean, you can go all the way back to the beginning, really. I made a recording earlier this week, about how your vote really doesn't make that much of a difference, and how the founding fathers dealt with this issue of tyranny of the majority. This idea that basically we're incapable of self-managing, that a majority could do some really terrible stuff to some minorities if we were given the opportunity to have a direct democracy. So essentially, like, we're not trustworthy enough to manage our own government, which is really ironic, that I bring this up, like, with right wing folks sometimes, who usually they gravitate towards these ideas of freedom and small government and you know the capability of the individual to make rational choices in their own self-interest and neoliberal economic underpinnings. But when you talk about this stuff, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, like they knew what they were doing, like that's true. Um, but I wonder if it really is. It's like, what was the minority they were trying to protect? And of course, all of them didn't feel the same way. They argued incessantly about everything. And probably the biggest, most well known rift was between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton was a, like a silver spoon type. He's a rich kid who he was. He came up with some like savvy, financial, innovative ideas to get America out of debt after the Revolution when they owed a bunch of money to France. Um, and he succeeded, but him and Thomas Jefferson disagreed because Thomas Jefferson was seeing how he was kind of setting things up to where it was going to hook up rich people and the banks specifically to be able to have too much control over the government. And so they argued about this a lot. And it fell into these kind of like two camps, these two like belief tribes. Probably my other favorite one is James Madison, because he argued a lot for similar things, like a very well educated citizenry that is capable of and transparency. That's important because education and transparency like allows people in a democracy to vote more for what's best for the whole country. It lets them see that. Or if you're hiding stuff and you're trying to keep people stupid, which is part of the strategy. It has been part of the strategy for quite a while. It makes it harder for them to do that. So, anyways, back to that question though, like who were they really trying to protect? They were slave owners. Some of them became abolitionists later, like Ben Franklin is a famous example of that. But if it wasn't racial minorities they were trying to protect, then like what is the minority they were trying to protect? Because like think of it. What, like, who would they be thinking about? People who like football, or what? Like, is it just people who disagree on one issue? Isn't that the whole point of like majority rule? Like the if you vote on something, if you vote on whether to raise taxes or not, and the majority says not to raise taxes, is that a tyranny of the majority? Like, that's not what they're talking about, right? This stuff even goes back before them. It goes back to, there was a guy in John Locke's time, because the founding fathers, they used the philosophy of John Locke as a foundation for their framework for the U.S. government. And yeah, they changed some things. Like John Locke had three branches of government also, but they were different. The founding fathers made some modifications, but the general idea was the same, and the underlying principles were the same. So this guy, Edmund Burke, he was a conservative British monarchist back in John Locke's time. He was anti-democracy, obviously. He's saying that was his major criticism of John Locke. He was saying tyranny of the majority. And we could probably like pull something up, and look, if you guys wanted to, about what Edmund Burke actually said. And the criticisms he actually made. But he was basically saying that if the king is going crazy and, murdering people or like rounding people up and putting them in jail, then the people know who to blame. But if it's a majority doing it, there's no way to really stop them. So, and he was talking mainly about, like political disagreements over like maybe like land use, things like that, which could apply to the United States also. But anyways, long story short, what they did was they stood up this representative republic with the electoral college and all that. So it took voting power away from the citizens. And it, I mean, just putting that criticism aside for a second, you can see that a lot of the shit that has happened in the United States, it wouldn't have been allowed to happen if we had direct democracy. You know, people just wouldn't tolerate it. But yeah, they're really good at this. They've been perfecting it over 200 years, how to, take the control of the system away. And it started all the way back then. It started with Alexander Hamilton. But even deeper than that, right? And what I think has been happening, even like if we look back even further, before Alexander Hamilton, before the United States Revolution, the thing that really allowed any of those ideas about freedom and democracy and the individual autonomy, the stuff it says in the Declaration of Independence about every human has the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. John Locke also said that in a different way. I think Thomas Jefferson changed it. But the foundation of those ideas goes all the way back to, at least to the Enlightenment. I mean, you could trace like the seedlings of it all the way back to the very beginning of, human thought. But the real big turn towards the underpinnings of it came in the Italian Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. Because there was a huge movement towards humanism in the church. The Renaissance humanists were very critical of the Catholic Church, and they argued for a shift in Christianity and spiritual practice to be more centered on humans and like all the poor people, basically, that Christianity is supposed to be giving a shit about based on, its origins in that. And they did a lot of work on this. They did a lot of work. They actually had like alternative education systems, which is another, tangent that we could go down. But like, our word school is based on the Catholic scholastic system. Scholasticism was like the Catholic philosophy and methodology of their education system that was all designed around teaching people about God and making them literate so they could read the Bible. So that our school system is based on that. The humanists had a different educational method, and it focused primarily around something back then they called philology. Today it would be called linguistics. But they studied these kind of like trends and the shifts in language structure over time. And there's a lot more to that. But anyways, these big changes that happened then marked a huge shift in human consciousness, and it's like everybody tends to look back at that and romanticize it as like that it was this great period, and it was in a lot of ways. Like, we have science, we have individual freedom, we have all that stuff that came from it. But the thing is that if you kind of step back and try to look at the big picture of what was happening and the currents of human thought and philosophy and everything, before that, because we're born into this world right now where we just kind of grow up assuming that everything was always like this. But when you start looking back at how life was back then and how people thought and what was going on, and you start getting some context, historical context, and kind of piecing that patchwork all together, you start to see that people thought about the world and themselves and their place in the world much differently through different phases of our, civilizational development. So in the Enlightenment, there was a big shift from the previous, which was very centered on the church. And it was like basically, God, they know what God wants everybody to do, and they dictate, the structure and the order and everything. And there wasn't really, like, nobody even really questioned those ideas of like freedom and autonomy and stuff. It wasn't like in, it wasn't in the collective consciousness. So when the Protestant Revolution happened, which is a whole nother offshoot too, like the Renaissance humanism and all that stuff kind of allowed that to happen too. It anticipated that, but like the Lutheran Protestants went, high and right into like biblical literalism and some other thing. They, whatever. We can get to that, but they I mean, it makes sense too because they did influence the Puritans later that founded the first American settlements. But regardless, like back to the whole thing we were talking about with this big shift in the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. So this shift in philosophy and art, like it all kind of happened at the same time. And when I think about this stuff too, it reminds me of I don't know if any of y'all ever read Rick Ross's book about the creative act, about how artists. He thinks artists kind of pick up on this like vibe or something that's out there in the ether. They have. I think the analogy he uses that they have like an antenna. And that's why sometimes, you'll have an idea for something and, you kind of forget about it. And then a few years later, you'll notice that somebody did that or somebody created that thing that you were thinking about creating. So I feel like that is kind of how all this stuff works. It's strange, like for instance, that Leibniz and Isaac Newton concurrently developed calculus, like separately. I mean, there's some, whatever, maybe that's not the best example because there's some, there's some controversy over like if, they stole ideas from each other or whatever, but anyways, this shift was marked by a focus on the individual, right? So they called Rene Descartes, the guy that came up with the Cartesian coordinate system. He was a mathematician, but he was also a philosopher, and he was into everything. This guy was like fully insane. He was dissecting cadavers and trying to find out how your brain interacted with the physical world, and he's the one who came up with the idea that's in your pineal gland. And nowadays, like a lot of like mysticism people talk about a calcified pineal gland, and that's even like conspiracy theory stuff. That all goes back to him, because what happened was he did this thought experiment. And it seems like when you read it and you hear about it and you learn about it in school, if you take philosophy, whatever, it seems like, okay, I can see that makes sense. But you learn about it like kind of piecemeal, like in a vacuum, without all the context usually. So what he did was he said, I'm just like, your senses can be deceived. How do you know what's real? It could be a dream, whatever. But so I'm just going to doubt all that. I'm just gonna say like I don't know if any of that stuff's true, but one thing I know for sure is that I exist because I'm having thoughts, and if I didn't exist, how could I even be thinking of this? So that's his starting point, right? And then he builds his whole system of philosophy from that. But the thing about it is that that's a very ego like the starting point is the ego, is the self. Um, and at the same time, you have, well, I mean, slightly earlier, but, you know, more or less the same time, you have the Renaissance humanists, the Renaissance artists figuring out their perspectivism in art and this big shift to individual perspective and individual thought, like this big like glorification of individuality happened back then, which in a lot of ways is good for sure, but it was so celebrated and so glorified, and it was pretty much throughout most of modernity, the period following. um yeah, so you get this big shift, right? And that allows these ideas to develop, like liberalism. And in the very beginning, a lot of these folks were very optimistic and flowery about their, their expectations and their celebration of like the liberation of the individual and the primacy of reason and logic, and how hopeful they were for the future because we were going to use our higher faculties to work together now that we're free from all this oppression, like thought control stuff from the church or whatever it was. I mean, a lot. It's not like these people just shucked off religion immediately. Like they didn't do that. All these people were deeply Christian, including Isaac Newton, who was he wrote more on Christianity, biblical hermeneutics, than he did on science or whatever, astronomy. He was he was an Aryan, not like the Nazi version. It was like a debate around the Trinity and the equality of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. He he was a part of a heretical group who believed that the Son was inferior to the Father, which is another rabbit hole we could go down with these, like, you know, astrological archetypes and whatnot. But anyways, these ideas that they had about, the power of reason and logic, and how these things were gonna save humanity and we were gonna build this great new world with all these powers that we have. Um, that led to the Industrial Revolution and the formation of liberal democracies and social contract theory too. Like, social contract theory, it takes the idea of the individual as like the primary unit, like the building block of a civilization or a society, right? So let me open something up over here. This is or maybe I can turn this up. It seems like a little dark in here or something. I don't know. Whatever. So yeah. What were we saying? So, social contract theory. They believed that the individual was like the primary building block of a society, right? So you put two individuals together, maybe they don't agree, they come to a compromise, right, on, whose land is what, how they're going to work things out between themselves to live peacefully without, murdering each other, stealing each other's stuff or whatever. So, add more people, get more people in the mix, and then more people in the mix, and eventually they start coming up with some form of government, some like system to keep everybody, in check. Because the more people you get, the more It becomes unmanageable without something like that in place. And that's pretty much like the general basic rundown of what social contract theory is. So if you take that, fast forward, you know, you get John Locke, you get neoliberal economic theory. And another thing about this was like that this reliance on reason and logic and everything, it kind of created a division, like a split. So back to what we were saying about Rene Descartes. He started with that, like my thoughts are real, right? So all you have is thoughts. But how do you get from the thoughts to like concrete reality, the physical world? So what he did was he built all of this like thought stuff up, and he ended up getting to the point where, okay, my mind is interfacing with something out there, and he built up all this evidence for why it's real and whatever. Like it to us, it seems like, okay, that's common sense. The world exists, whatever. But he was really trying to work it out on the level of like, what is it? What is it made of? It's what they call ontology, right? And he ended up deciding that it had to be something different. It's not thoughts. It's something out there separate, other than us, than our thoughts, our soul, our spirit, whatever you want to call it. So he divided it into two different realms, the mental world and the physical world. And this is what they call duality, or mind-body dualism. And so it split human consciousness kind of into these two worlds. And through the rise of the reason, logic, and that mode of thinking, this also led to, and this is also, something that starts back in Aristotle and logic and, the very beginnings of philosophy itself, is, like the law of non-contradiction, and you have two opposite things, right? So the contradictory thing can't be true. Like, something can't be true and false at the same time. So this way of thinking led to these thought patterns of like this black and white thinking, and these thoughts of superiority and inferiority. Before, it wasn't like as prevalent to see assumptions of like like light is better than dark, or cold is better than heat, or whatever. It's like they're just things. And people still talk about this sometime today, but sometimes like these things that are opposite, these dualities, they, like, you can see that they're kind of two sides of the same coin, right? Like, you've seen people say that, I'm sure. That like, oh, you can't have like happiness without sadness, or you can't have light without dark, or whatever. Yeah, and there's like tons of ways we can go with that too, but the reason that I'm bringing it up is that this shift into this new mode of consciousness led to this rift into this like subversion of certain ideas to other ideas, where you have now like darkness is inferior to light, or really what ended up happening was that whole world of the mental and the spirit and the soul and the psyche and all that got subverted to physicalism and physical reality, what they call materialism. And this was huge back then, like empirical theory and It's how science and the scientific method emerged, which again is like, we're not saying it's a bad thing. We're just saying that it overtook everything else to the point where, later, not even that long ago, there was a school that emerged in philosophy called logical positivism. And the logical positivists, they were basically anti-philosophy, like anti-metaphysics especially. So basically anything that wasn't proven by science was like a waste of time to them. If science can't confirm it, and they thought also that this is really a philosophy of science. They're saying that what science is doing is it's confirming truths about the world to us. And anything that's not a confirmed truth of science is pretty much useless. So, anyways, this happened, right? This whole shift towards this like physicalist, materialist worldview happened. And you even see it in, obviously like industrialization and capitalism and all that is based around that. And economics, it's very, like, people even call consumerism materialism. It's not that far removed. It's like got its basis in philosophical materialism, where it's like a focus on material things, as being more important than love or family or whatever. So anyways, if we're going back to that, all right, so the materialist worldview started dominating, and capitalism took root in liberal democracy. Karl Marx, I mean, there were criticisms. There were like socialist theory other than Karl Marx, before Karl Marx, and at the same time as Karl Marx. But his became dominant. But he took his ideas from another philosopher named Hegel. Hegel had something called the dialectical process, where in Hegel's dialectical process, the basic rundown is, an idea emerges in the world, in human consciousness, whatever, in human civilization. And then the opposite idea comes to like refute it. People come up with like, well, and this is also like a kind of a symptom of what we were saying before, this like mode of thought, this like logical reasoning, like, well, what's the opposite, and what if the opposite is true? So in thinking about that, those two ideas start to clash, and in the process of their like combat with each other, they strip away all the falsehood that they can, and a new idea emerges. It's a synthesis of these two, is what he says. And this is like an extreme oversimplification that I kind of really hate, because there's so much more depth and like good in Hegel and this whole process that he's talking about. But when the synthesis emerges, you get again the opposite idea, and then this process continues, and that's how that's like the driver of the evolution of human thought. Give me 1 second. Let me get a water. All right, so he also had a part of this was something that is called the Lord and Bondsman. And he's talking about this more on like a psychical level, where he's saying that when you recognize another person, like there's this interaction that happens, right? Like on an animal, very like instinctive primal level, where you enter into like a struggle for dominance, basically. And it doesn't even have to be like physical. It's just like it's something that happens, and you inevitably get someone who is the controller and someone is being controlled. And in this relationship, it forms this strange interaction where the person who's subjugated ends up doing all of the creative value production, and the person who's controlling does none of that. But they need each other because the person who's controlling, he sees himself realize and all the value that they're trying to, claim for themselves is in the other, and vice versa. Like the subjugated other is struggling to break free and get control, and they want to have the control that the other does. So it's funny because that's another thing that's in there, is that like everything already contains the inversion of itself, like in its existence, in Hegel. But Marx pretty much took these ideas, right? And Hegel called it the dialectical process. The reason I brought up the Lord and Bondsman is because Marx kind of riffs off of that with class struggle. He applies that same dynamic to social classes of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he applies it in what he says is a materialist way. He's coming from a materialist worldview, whereas Hegel was an idealist. Hegel thought that thoughts and forms, which is a Platonic idea, he thought that these things were more real than, the physical world. Anyways, Marx called his theory dialectical materialism. So you can see the shift, the emphasis on materialism. But the thing is, when it comes to those ideas, ontology, metaphysics, there was a lot of work done to kind of kill metaphysics. Hume had his critique of causality, even though he's the one who really championed empiricism as like basically the only thing we had to work with. He did have a criticism of causality where he said, all of our logical thought about the world, about empiricism, about like science and how do we figure things out and how does the world work, that it's all based on this assumption that like causes result in like effects always, and that this is like a constant of the universe. And the reason that we assume that is because we don't have any evidence otherwise. But there's a problem there. They call it the problem of induction, or some people call it the black swan problem. Like they thought all swans were white until one day they saw a black one, and they're like, oh shit, they're not all white. But, maybe for thousands and thousands of years, people thought swans were all white, and there's no such thing as a black swan because that's not a real thing. So what Hume is saying is that can be true about causality, that there's no guarantee that the universe is just going to keep working the way that it always has. We just make that assumption based on past observations, the same way we do with like all swans are white. And there's no way to prove it. Like there's literally no thing that you can point to in the world that shows that it will always be that way no matter what. So he said that he thinks that the reason that we do that is more of something like of an instinct. And this is before Darwin and like evolutionary theory, and they knew how brains worked and all that. Like, so this is pretty like good thinking on his part, right? Um, but that really bothered Kant, and Kant um, tried that his whole philosophical project was to try to solve this problem that David Hume presented. And he thought he solved it by he kind of did a similar thing to what Descartes did and separated these two worlds of thought, of mental and physical, by saying that we just don't have access to things, to the real world. Like this thing, it looks like this to me, and it feels like this to me, and my senses like interpret it a certain way, but that's my way of interpreting it. And I don't know if other people have the same interpretation. I think they probably do because they're like me. But it gets even weirder when you think of it like through the eyes of like a bumblebee or something, or like what is the real thing? How is it really in its own existence of being that thing? Like what is the stuff underneath that we can't really access? So he basically walled that off from us and said, we don't get to access that ever. It's there. There is something that it's like to be that thing in itself, is what he calls it, but you don't ever get to understand what it is. And so he kind of painted us into a little box, but the whole thing was like to try to solve these metaphysical problems. And then you have like this whole, that kind of kick-started the whole German idealism movement, and leading to Nietzsche, where I see Nietzsche as kind of he's almost not even a philosopher. He's like an anti-philosopher in a lot of ways. Um, he did wonder a lot about metaphysics and determinism and free will and those kind of things, but he mainly represented this big inversion of Platonism itself and getting rid of this whole like ideal world. How Hegel thought everything was ideas. Well, Nietzsche hated Hegel, and he totally rejected religion, um, especially Christianity. He hated Christianity and thought it made people weak, and he championed individualism and ego to an extreme. Um, so again, here you have like this strengthening of materialism and egoism in Nietzsche, and a complete rejection and subversion of Platonism and idealism. Um, and I think really, if you look at some of the things Nietzsche was doing to be disruptive, he in question, ethics and morality, and upset some of these things. I think he was somewhat of a like a radical traditionalist in the sense that he really embraced these like Homeric, like Greek hero attributes, and glorified them above what he saw was the weakening of humanity because of the influence of Christianity and humility and self-sacrifice and the things that people thought were values and virtues under Christianity, but he saw them as vices. But instead, he really pumped these people up like the, the the heroes from like Greek myth and epic poems and all that. So I think another thing that started happening there is he was anticipating the rise of postmodernism and existentialism. They're tied together in a lot of ways, but he he definitely had some similarities with these people. And go forward again to Karl Marx. and this whole unfolding of this, you know, this thesis antithesis relationship between capitalism and Marxism. And this kind of dictates the next, however long that was, maybe what, 80, 100 years or something, I don't know. Maybe even longer than that. But as this kind of like ideological battle unfolds, even at the very beginnings of it, there was a Marx contemporary. What was his name? He was like one of the guys that was with Emil Durkheim, like the fathers of sociology. Let me see. Yeah, Max Weber. Emil Durkheim and Max Weber. They kind of kicked off like the whole sociology movement. Along with Marx. You know, studying like how human society changes and evolves over time. So Max Weber made all these criticisms. I think he anticipated postmodernism as well, because he started really criticizing some of the underpinnings of modernity, which is how we started this conversation. So now you hear people criticize this a lot. You hear people criticize postmodernism, and Jordan Peterson is one of these that likes to say these postmodernist neo-Marxists, which some people point out is contradictory, but I'm not so sure that it is really. Like, I think he understands something. I'm not like a big advocate or fan of Jordan Peterson necessarily, but just hear me out. So the postmodernists criticized Marxism, like explicitly, specifically Marxism, especially Foucault. But the reason they did it was because Marxism is based on this idea that human history and behavior and everything follows this kind of theme, this pattern. It's like this big story, this big like grand narrative that, like it, if you follow the story, then you can predict like the ending of the story and where the story goes. And what the postmodernists were saying, one of the main things they were saying was that that's not true. Like, it's that they tried to tear that idea apart, that there's some kind of big story of humanity that tells us where we're going and what our purpose is, and why we're here and all. So they really worked on deconstructing a lot of these underpinnings of modernism, especially the stuff we were talking about before, like the like the primacy of reason and the materialism and all that stuff. So in doing that, you can kind of see even like what happened on the left in left-wing politics. A lot of political philosophers, even not that long ago, like in the last 20, 30 years, have shifted away from Marx theory and like orbiting around that. Even though there's like lots of alternatives, like I said. But they shifted from orbiting around Marxism and class struggle and these kinds of conversations, like economic, labor theory of value and modes of production and all that. They started kind of shifting away from that and more into the postmodern theory. And you can even see it in pop culture too. Like, for instance, the like whole counterculture movement of the 60s, the free love, hippies, like, this was happening at the same time as postmodernism. Like, the postmodern thinkers, this is what I was saying again about like these ideas, these thoughts, these things like emerge in the world at a similar time. And it's not like, I mean, maybe some of these folks were paying attention to like Foucault and Derrida and all that, but this was happening in France in the '60s, and these guys did not speak English. I mean, some of it might have got translated and trickled over, but I don't know. That's interesting. Like, we should probably look into that more of like how much of a direct influence they might have actually had. But if you can kind of see what they're doing with deconstructing these things and breaking these barriers down, they're opening up like a freedom for people to, and like I said, this was like also anticipated in existentialism, but it's like the freedom to make up your own story, basically, or make up your own values. Um, and yeah, it it really led to like a lot of wacky outcomes and like chaos. But I think like if you look at kind of the way these things work, right, and throughout history and all that, like this is not a new thing. It's just like it's like this punctuated equilibrium kind of deal. This evolutionary um, theory. Like the original Darwin is like gradual small changes accumulating over time leads to big changes eventually. But what punctuated equilibrium is and what they found, things like the Cambrian explosion is probably the biggest. All of a sudden these like tons of new life forms in the sea started showing up in the fossil record. Like where did they all come from? Like all at once. I think this kind of stuff happens in thought and human, these patterns are like mirrored through levels. You know, this is just another level that these same patterns get echoed through. And it feels like that we're at kind of a transition point, where postmodernism really broke down these kind of the walls and the structures, as they call it, post-structuralism, the structures of modernity that are kind of like now allowing for it to crumble and to ultimately, hopefully, be replaced by something better. Um, we always think it's going to be better. They thought modernity was going to be better. So I think that's how it works. Like a lot of, from for example, Mark Fisher, the leftist political commentator, philosopher, writer, who he started talking a little bit about that. I mean, other people too started kind of wondering, like, what could the alternative be? I think Mark Fisher's famous quote about it in his capitalist realism is it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And that's usually what people think about. It's like post-apocalyptic shows, rebuilding civilization from the ground up because everything collapsed. Um, and I don't think it necessarily has to go that way. I mean, it absolutely could. I don't think we've gotten to the tipping point yet, and I don't know if we will, um, soon. But nobody knows. Like nobody knew the Civil War was going to happen until you know you woke up one day and it was happening. Um, there can be a lot of speculation about these things, but nobody knows for sure. But it does definitely feel like we are in the end of an age, and everything's getting primed for a transition into something new. Um, and a lot of people might say that, well, it doesn't really seem that way with like how the US government has just solidified their position and they've like built this fortress, this impenetrable castle that we can't do anything to affect any change from, within. And like the idea of a revolution seems like a fantasy because, they're so good at disrupting that stuff and it's like a David versus Goliath type of situation. But it seems to me like it is true that it's destroying itself slowly but surely. Because of that rigidity and that like inability to continue to grow. Like I even see it in science. For instance, like science is trying so hard to cling to the whole like Einsteinian, the like positivist view of science. I mean, I know there's a lot of really smart and really insightful scientists out there who are a lot smarter than me, who do think outside the box and they are considering like alternative metaphysical possibilities and everything. I'm not saying like all scientists are you know incapable of thinking about these things because they're locked into this scientific worldview. But a lot of them are, and it's just like it's not even about scientists. It's about the prevailing worldview among humanity. Like we were saying before the Enlightenment, before the Renaissance, that people didn't think of the world that way. They didn't think of it like that way at all. They didn't think about individual. There's even we've talked about it before on here, but there's this theory of the bicameral mind, and some even take it even further. Like the bicameral mind theory was that Julian Jaynes, psychologist, who argued that, and he used like psychology to do it, as opposed to some other folks who have talked about differing human consciousness prior to him, who didn't have access to science, neuroscience, and psychology and all that. But he said that people didn't always consider their internal monologue to be themselves. They were talking to themselves. They thought, it was the ancestors or the gods guiding them. And he uses all these historical references and his knowledge of psychology to make his case. But suffice it to say, people thought differently in general. Like the general view of what the world was and how everything worked and what your place in the world was in the medieval age was different, if you were born then than if you were born after the Enlightenment or during the Enlightenment. I don't know. The shift really seemed to kind of reach a tipping point with Isaac Newton and that revolution, and then another big turning was the Einsteinian revolution. And these like mirror things in philosophy too, like we were saying. But I think what we're approaching now is another big shift like that. Another big like revolution in human consciousness and human worldview. And I think it ties in really well to the whole integral theory stuff and integral politics, which, the main proponent of integral theory is Ken Wilber. And he's really drawing a lot of inspiration from a lot of places. He's like super multidisciplinary, whatever. But Eastern spirituality, everything. But one of the major influences on that is clearly Gene Gebser and the idea of the integral age, which I even think was talked about by Martin Buber as well, which Martin Buber is one of my favorite philosophers. He's also kind of not fully a philosopher either. He writes in more kind of, it's almost like poetry, the way he writes. Um, but he talks about some really interesting ideas. And I think even more so than Gebser, he is in touch a little bit with this idea of like an alternative ontology to materialism. Because he kind of starts out I and thou with the idea that reality is created in the act of relationship. Like in its reality is basically it's a verb, not a noun. It's not a thing. Like things aren't things. Things are like happenings. They're occurrences. And he kind of applies this to this whole concept of he splits it into kind of three different categories. One is the way that we relate to the world and things in the world, and our tendency to look at things as objects. You know, like that are separate from us, that don't really matter. They're just like dead. You know, they're inanimate objects that have no like relevance or value or anything beyond their usefulness to us. And he says that this is not like a he really is getting to the point that like this is the source of like our like despair about our position in the world, and like this existential crisis and all that. He's saying that if we see things as they are and like relate to them as what they are, then we have like a almost like a reverence for them, and that seeing things in that way is like much more gratifying. But it's not because of the gratification and the like what we get from it to see things that way. It's just because that is the way that things are, and that seeing them in the other way is like it's more of a pragmatic way, maybe like for survival and those kind of things. But it's not like the truth, I guess. The next category is how we relate to other people. So he says we do the same thing with people. We see people as humans like us who have these like rich internal lives with goals and dreams and experiences like we do, and we relate to them that way, and we humanize them, or not, or we view them as objects, and we other them, and we value them for their usefulness to us, or we devalue them for their the problems they cause us. Um, yeah, we could say a lot more about that, but like it's been used. That principle has been used in so much, like conflict resolution, human relationships, philosophy, and there's a lot of potential. That principle leads to things like the civil rights, um, nonviolent resistance and stuff. So, anyways, the last category that he talks about is relationship to divinity or God, um, which really kind of ties it brings it all home. And a lot of times people leave that part out when they're talking about like the human relations, like conflict resolution stuff, because so that turns some people off. Um, Martin Buber was a very religious um, uh, Jewish. He might have even been a rabbi, or he was somehow involved in theology. But anyways, I think that he kind of heralded this coming of. He predicted, right, that because of this, like because we've gotten into this like very materialist, anti-spiritual state, that we're like deeply afflicted and we feel like this hollowness and like longing for reconnection. And he predicted that there would be an age of this spiritual reawakening of humanity. So I think that the what he's talking about is the same thing as what Gene Gebser is talking about when he says that he notices the emergence of a new form of human consciousness developing back when he was writing in the 40s. And he called it integral consciousness. So back to like the whole Ken Wilber and the integral theory and everything. I think the great big idea in integral theory is this concept. He takes a lot from psychology and human developmental theory, and like human motivation theory and some of these things in psychology. And one of the things is this idea that humans progress through these phases of emotional development. And it really mirrors a lot of what Gebser says. But Gebser applies it to humanity as a whole. So does Ken Wilber, but the people that he was kind of taking these ideas from, he synthesized a lot of these ideas. The psychologists that he was taking it from in the first place were more focused on individual development at first, and then they kind of expanded it to humanity. And you know, they're all riffing off of each other, but it's similar to what Gene Gebser talks about how we started out with basically animal consciousness, and then we emerged into a state of like tribalist animism, and very early consciousness that was concurrent with like the development of language, because without abstract language, when language was just like all verbal and before written language, the ability for abstract thought is very limited. You know, it's not until the emergence of written language and then the further development of that you start to get increased abstract thought, because you know, the original written languages were basically pictograms, like hieroglyphics, even before that, you know, Sumerian language and whatnot. You know, like the symbol for like a river used to be a river, like a picture of a river, and that eventually became like an S or whatever, you know, like through linguistic morphology stuff. But as language developed, right, it causes this expansion of human ability to think abstractly, right? And that's how consciousness evolved, to be able to do this like problem solving and develop these concepts that we just build upon and build upon. And this is why I'm kind of skeptical of like some of these you know, super advanced civilization prior to the last ice age theories and stuff. Not that I'm saying that they're absolutely wrong. Like it could be that, you know, everything just got destroyed so badly that, you know, we essentially just had to start over. But so I'm absolutely not saying that there's no way that's true or whatever. It's just it took so long, right, to develop those things. And you know, I don't know. It's thinking about it now, it's like it's so complex. You know, because we still have people in the world who are stuck in like a certain phase, like uncontacted tribes and things like that. So, I mean, it's possible that, like, you know, at some, could have got wiped out, like, back to some level, but not completely. So, like I said, I'm not saying anything definitive here, but in order to create advanced technology like spaceships and aircraft, you had to first go through all these like foundational steps to develop the level of abstraction that's necessary. You know, like the the ancient Greeks, they had no concept of thermodynamics because they didn't. It's not because they were stupid and they couldn't figure it out. Like they would have been able to figure it out if they had gone through those necessary foundational steps to develop the modes of thought necessary to even conceptualize that. You know what I mean? So, anyways, yeah. What Gebser is saying is that the second phase that he calls the magical structure is characterized by like animism and like very spiritual kind of like tight community based. And this is similar to what Claire Graves and Don Beck, the spiral dynamics guys, and Ken Wilber, they call it I think they call I know they differ a little bit in their colors or whatever. I think they call it the purple. They call it purple. They have color codes for their phases. So the interesting thing about this though is that, like, okay, for example, the next one in spiral dynamics is red, but in Gebser he calls it the mythical structure. And this is an age that's like characterized by empire building, conquests, and like the age of myth and like that whole thing. But in spiral dynamics they call it red, and it's characterized by like the expression of ego and power. So one of the things that the spiral dynamics folks talk about is that it shifts, right? So the first emergence is into the purple or the magical. It's like tribal. It's almost like when you're an infant, you are born into a family, and this is where you like have not yet differentiated yourself from your parents and your family. And then when you start developing like this sense of self and developing your ego identity is the red phase. You start like pushing back against that and like trying to emerge and exert yourself into the world. And this is basically what humanity itself was doing, like against nature. It's like being born out of the womb, and there's tons of symbology and myth and like reference to Mother Nature as being womb-like. So the next phase, the next structure, Gebser calls the mental, right? And that's where philosophy starts. And they would call that, I don't know, I think maybe there's some overlap because the next one they have is blue, and then it goes into orange. So the way the spiral dynamics works, what I was saying was like, okay, so red, you move into ego. In blue, which is characterized by religious communities and like Chinese legalism, were these heavily structured, like rule-based communities, right? It's a focus again on community. And then orange is more back to ego, about figuring out the rules and how to navigate these systems that have been created and to benefit yourself. And then, so orange is very recent, right? Orange is definitely part of Gebser's mental structure. And then even more recent, which is not even until, as Ken Wilber talks about, until the 60s and the counterculture movement and the hippies, and the postmodernism and all that. He calls the green, they call the green. And for Gebser, this is also still part of the mental structure, but it might be like part of the emergence or the transition into the integral. But anyways, the green is, again, a shift back towards community, right? But now it's like a globalist view of community, right? So you see this like process of this stepping back, constant like stepping back and getting a bigger picture view of humanity and the world and culture and society and sociology and all those things. But I think the really revolutionary idea in integral theory and spiral dynamics is this idea of what they call the tier 2 shift, which is after green, after postmodernism, where they say, you know, through all this process, right, there's a tendency to look back down and be like, oh, well, you know, I'm better than that now. I've progressed beyond that. I'm past that. You know, in the red, you're like an egomaniac kind of, right? And then when you go into the blue, you're like, man, that was kind of like disrespectful to my community and my elders. And like I was, you know, like not cognizant of all these rules and like why these rules are important. So you'll look down on people who are in that phase as being like rambunctious or disruptive and try to, you know, enforce these rules on them. And then when you emerge into the orange, you start to look down on the people in the blue and say like, oh, well, man, these people just haven't figured it out yet. They don't know how to navigate the system, you know, as well as I do. And then the people in the green start looking down on the orange are like the, you know, the libertarians, like the, you know, probably neoliberal economics was in there and all that stuff. But the green starts to look at, man, these people, these orange people are really, it's funny, I don't mean Donald Trump, but these orange people are really like, you know, exploiting all these people, and like it's not fair what they're doing, and they're causing all these problems, and they're, you know, they're not being nice to, they're messing up the world, right? It's creating all these power imbalances, and you know, they also have this like big embrace of the postmodern, you know, subjectification of values, where it's like, well, everybody's free to explore their own reality and their own, you know, modes of self-expression, and they can just kind of do whatever they want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. They can believe whatever they want. But the green are looking down on the orange again. So finally, in spiral dynamics, you get to this point where there's this radical shift in the way that you look at these phases of development. Because now that you can step back and see them, you can see that, oh, wait, this is a process that everybody has to go through. Everybody has to develop through these phases to get to where I'm at, or where I want to be, or whatever. And in that realization, you're able to step back again in a bigger picture and say like, okay, well, like, what do I need to do to, you know, like emerge out of this so that I can like get out of other people's way, basically, so that they can just go through their phases and get to where I'm at. And then on top of that one, there's another one moving back into community, and because, right, the green was into community, so the emergence into the next one, I think they call it teal. It's either yellow or teal. I get those confused. I think it might actually be yellow. Emerging into this phase is a focus on self and like, shoot, I was wrong about some of these things. Like, I need to like figure this stuff out. But you're seeing the process for what it is, and you're no longer like judging these people for being wrong about where they're at in the process. You're starting to figure out ways to like meet people where they're at, and then I think moving into the next one, teal or whatever it is, back into the community, is to really to start to develop not just like individual modes of interacting with other people and a not judgmental way or a less judgmental way or whatever. Because even in green, there pretends to be like this acceptance of everybody and everything, but the thing that they can't accept is people who don't accept the green worldview of the, you know, like postmodern flattening of like in the um, subjectification of values and truth and all those kind of things. A lot of people see that as problematic, and that's why the greens like clash with the people underneath. Um, for instance, like it, in I mean, it started in even in Marx and all that. But on the left, there's like some people even characterize left wing politics by saying that it's anti hierarchy, and that, you know, power structures are just all illegitimate, and there should be no such thing as like anybody being superior to or in control of another person. um, which like at face value it seems like, well, that should be true. Everybody should be equal. We're all human, right? Like there's no reason why somebody else should have say so over me and my life and what I do. I think a lot of I think a lot of right wing folks would agree with that too. Like that's kind of like an attitude of liberalism itself, which is why I was saying that postmodernism is like an extreme, like dark side version of the beginnings of the Enlightenment idea of liberalism. You know what I mean? It's like we got to that was the beginning, this like flowery optimistic view, and then postmodernism is like the other side of it. You know, it's like it's the extreme, you know, everybody's free to do whatever they want. Like it's the maximization of all of those ideas, like free from all constraints of like spirituality, rules of any kind. You know, even like like reality itself. But you know, all that shit aside, what I was saying about power structures, right? That's a big um, aversion in that, you know, that whole group, the green thinkers. So much to the point where it's like if people start getting a lot of recognition or like trying to step up and take leadership roles, it's like they a lot of times they get torn down. They get called like champagne socialists or, you know, whatever it is. Like Russell Brand said something about that before he got kicked out of the left and to the right. He said like when he was poor, people said he was jealous, and when he made a bunch of money, they said he was a hypocrite. So I think that that next level though is like a radical transformation in, you know, individual perspective, but it's also happening on a social cultural level too. You know, enough people get to that point, it affects the it affects like the whole group, right? It becomes like a movement in human thought that people follow. So I think what's happening, what I see happening, is that this movement is growing, and once it gets enough people, it will topple all of this, crap that's been happening before, in such a way that a new kind of possibility will emerge that we haven't been able to think of yet. Now, how we were talking about like the Gebser stuff and the modes of thought have to get to a certain point before people can even imagine solutions. Like what Mark Fisher said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world. But with this new emerging mode of thought, like it offers the possibility that we might be able to come up with something that we haven't come up with before. And I find that to be really exciting. You know, I find it to be also kind of inevitable that this will happen eventually. It might not even happen in my lifetime, but I feel like we're kind of in a period where there's shift is going on. And, you know, I mean, it's maybe not smart to try to boil it down to like a black and white uh, dichotomy of like, is it a good thing? Is it a bad good? I think it's probably both. There's going to be a lot of adjustment, and I mean there is right now still with what's happening right now in the world, and it could be something really weird that we don't like. Like there's tons of things that could happen. Like a lot of people are into the transhumanism stuff, and I can imagine like lots of ways that could turn into just a complete abomination of and like and mutilation of what humanity once was. But at the same time, like if we all turned into like AI neural net controlled cyborg super organism, and we're not human anymore. I don't know. Is that better or worse? I don't know. Like from where I'm sitting right now, it seems like a really terrible thing. Um, but I don't know. Thinking about those kind of things, it like opens up a whole new can of worms for me, and like maybe some of these like take me back to the Roman era. People like aren't as crazy as they come across sometimes, but I don't think that's the way. I think ideally we do have some kind of a synthesis of the benefits that we've gotten from modernity, the technology, the capability to you know ease suffering, prevent disease, being able to maintain some of those things, but also reclaim some of the things that we've lost in the process. Like you know, living more in harmony and more sustainably with nature instead of trying to continue this charade of pretending that we're like higher than nature, that we've transcended it somehow. I don't know if that's possible because in a way, like it seems like the whole entire project of humanity has been to try to subvert nature to the will of humanity. And to reach into this like transcendental state of these like Jovian gods. Like every god is a storm god. Like you know like Thor, Zeus, all the main gods of all the pantheons, and even the Christian God is based on a storm god from the Canaanite pantheon. I mean, it's blended with Jesus, that's a solar deity, and then the Holy Ghost, which is like a encapsulation of animism, and the Trinity is like a synthesis of all three of those things. But that's also another whole like rabbit hole to go down. Anyways, I'll just wrap it up there, and I'll see everybody next time. Later, y'all.